At 65, Margaret was exhausted, but you'd never hear her say it aloud. She was the mother who never stopped giving, the grandmother who never said no. If her daughter needed help watching the kids at 6 a.m., Margaret was there. If her son needed a ride to the airport or someone to pick up his dry cleaning, he barely asked anymore. He just assumed everyone needed her, all the time. But no one ever paused to ask, "Mom, are you okay?" They called her a blessing. They said, "We'd be lost without you." But that was just code for, "Don't stop." Inside, Margaret was quietly crumbling. Her knees ached from standing too long. Her doctor had warned her about rising blood pressure. She hadn't been to her book club in months. She couldn't remember the last time she ate a hot meal sitting down. And yet, every time she thought about taking a step back, guilt wrapped around her like a noose. "They need me," she'd whisper to herself. "I'm just helping." That's what mothers do. But then came the night that changed everything. It started small. A mild flu, nothing serious. Margaret texted her daughter to let her know she couldn't watch the grandkids the next day. The reply came back fast. "Are you serious? I already told my boss I'd be in. I don't have a backup, Mom." That mom carried more weight than any insult ever could. Not compassion, not concern, just disappointment. Margaret sat in bed, feverish and dizzy, reading the message over and over. She was sick, and somehow she was still the problem. Later that week, once she'd recovered, she returned to her usual routine. She cooked dinner for her son's family and dropped it off. She babysat twice, without a thank you. But the final straw wasn't from her children. It was from her 6-year-old grandson. She'd spent all afternoon pushing him on the swing, wiping his face, preparing snacks, and as she helped him pack up his toys, he looked up and asked with that innocent, piercing honesty only children have, "Grandma, why don't you have a fun life like other grandmas?" She blinked. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" He shrugged, "Like Grandma Nancy from school. She goes to Disney and has painting parties and a dog. You're just always cleaning." It was a dagger. That night, Margaret sat alone in the dark with her tea gone cold. Her hands trembled as she scrolled through her phone, pictures of herself smiling at birthdays, soccer games, holidays, but in all of them she looked tired, drained. Not a single photo showed her doing something just for herself. And then, like fate, a photo appeared from an old friend on Facebook, smiling wide on a beach in Maine, surrounded by art supplies and a women's travel group. The caption read, "I stopped giving everyone pieces of me and started living for me. At 66, I finally feel alive." Margaret stared at the words, and for the first time in her life, she let herself ask a dangerous question. What if I've been giving so much that there's nothing left of me to give? Margaret didn't announce her decision. She didn't stage a confrontation. She simply began to disappear. Not in bitterness, not in anger, but in silence. The next time her daughter called for help with the kids, Margaret paused before replying. Her heart pounded as she typed the words, "I can't today, I have plans." It was the first time in years she had used that sentence. Not an excuse, not an apology, just the truth. The reply came quickly, sharp as a blade. "Must be nice." No follow-up, no offer to reschedule. Just annoyance simmering beneath the words. Margaret stared at the screen, her stomach tightening. She hadn't expected gratitude, but she hadn't expected resentment either. The following weekend, her son dropped by with his laundry and 2 restless children. He placed the basket on her kitchen floor like he always did and said, "Thanks, Mom, I'll swing back later." Margaret didn't look up from the book she was reading. "I'm not doing laundry today," she said calmly. He blinked, confused. "What? I've got plans this afternoon. You're welcome to use the washer, but you'll have to handle it." Silence stretched between them. Her son's eyes narrowed. "You okay, Mom? You've been kind of off lately." She smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm finally getting back to myself. That's all." He scoffed, almost laughed. "Since when do you have plans?" That comment stung more than it should have. Margaret didn't respond. She walked away into her bedroom, closing the door gently behind her. Her legs were shaking. Her heart raced. She sat on the edge of her bed and took a deep breath. This was harder than she thought it would be. Not because she was unsure, but because of how quickly their affection turned cold when her usefulness vanished. Over the next few weeks, the pattern continued. Margaret began attending a beginner's painting class every Thursday night. She bought herself new brushes, a second-hand easel, even a colorful scarf she would have once told herself was too bold. It made her feel visible again. But the more she returned to herself, the more uncomfortable her family seemed. Her daughter called less, except to ask if she was still mad about something. Her son dropped hints about how everyone's been saying you're acting weird lately. Even her daughter-in-law, usually sweet, made a pointed remark at dinner. I guess now that you're retired, you're on vacation from the family too. Margaret didn't respond. She just excused herself from the table, walked into the kitchen, and exhaled. Her hands trembled, not with fear, but with restraint. Part of her wanted to scream. You don't get to be angry at me for finally treating myself like I matter. But she didn't scream. She didn't explain. She just let the silence speak. And yet, behind their anger and confusion, Margaret saw something else, something they couldn't quite name. Fear. Her family was afraid of what her change meant. If she stopped doing everything, they would have to do more. They would have to adjust, rebalance, grow. And growth is never comfortable. One night, as Margaret painted a still life in her quiet living room, her phone buzzed again. Her daughter. Hey, sorry if I've been distant, the message began. Just not used to you being unavailable. Margaret looked at the text, smiled softly, and replied, I know, I wasn't used to it either. The rebellion had begun, and she wasn't backing down. The tension didn't simmer, it boiled. The more Margaret chose herself, the more her family seemed to bristle. What began as confusion and subtle guilt-tripping soon turned into direct confrontation. It came to a head one Sunday afternoon. Margaret had invited everyone over, not for dinner, not to serve, but just for coffee and casual conversation. She had baked a single tray of muffins, set the table with mismatched teacups, and lit a lavender candle. It was simple, peaceful, hers. But as her son walked in, he glanced around with an almost mocking smirk. No big dinner today, no roast, no potatoes. His tone was light, but loaded. Margaret smiled gently. Nope, just muffins. I thought we could just talk today. Her daughter-in-law raised an eyebrow. You always do dinner, though. It's kind of your thing. Not anymore, Margaret said calmly. I'm trying something new. The silence that followed was loud. Chairs scraped, eyes darted, and her daughter, the one she had babysat for every week without fail, finally snapped. Okay, seriously, what is going on with you? She blurted. You've been acting different. You're always busy. You barely help out anymore. This just isn't like you, Mom. Margaret looked across the table, her hands resting on the warm ceramic of her mug. She didn't flinch. I'm tired of being everyone's unpaid staff. I love you all, but I've been so busy making everyone else's life easier that I forgot I had one of my own. Her daughter scoffed. So this is a punishment? No, Margaret said. This is a boundary. It was the first time she had said the word out loud. Boundary. It tasted strong in her mouth, like ginger and steel. Her family didn't know what to do with it. Her son leaned forward, defensive. So now we're not allowed to ask for help? You can ask, Margaret said. But you can't expect. And you can't be angry when I say no. Her grandson, sitting at the edge of the table, looked confused and a little scared. Are you mad at us, Grandma? Margaret turned to him, softening. Not at all, sweetheart. I'm just learning to take care of myself too. That doesn't mean I love you any less. But the room felt heavy. Her daughter stood visibly frustrated. You could have talked to us. You didn't have to just check out. I did talk, Margaret said, more quietly now. For years, just not with words. I showed up. I canceled my plans. I watched the kids, cooked, cleaned, smiled through it all. That was me talking. You just didn't hear it until I stopped. That night, after they left, Some storming, some silent. Margaret sat in her dim living room with only the flicker of a candle for company, and she cried. Not because she regretted anything, but because doing the right thing had never felt so lonely. But here's the thing. Margaret didn't back down. The next day she went to her art class. Her instructor, a retired school teacher named Helen, noticed her red eyes and said nothing, just handed her a canvas. Margaret painted. She cried a little more. And by the end of the class, something inside her had settled. She wasn't trying to win a fight. She was trying to win her life back. Over the next few weeks, the distance remained. Her daughter didn't call. Her son texted once or twice, short and transactional. The silence was new. It hurt, but it also gave her space, something she hadn't had in years. She filled that space with walks, with color, with music and quiet mornings. And slowly the grief began to melt into something else. Peace. Margaret had crossed a threshold. She had made a choice to stop being the family's foundation and start being her own. And though they hadn't accepted it yet, they would, or they wouldn't. Either way, Margaret wasn't going back. Weeks passed. The silence lingered like fog, thick and uncomfortable, especially between Margaret and her daughter. The woman who once called 5 times a week now barely texted. Her son, ever practical, seemed to adopt a wait-and-see approach, checking in with stiff politeness, but avoiding deeper conversations. And Margaret, for all her newfound peace, still felt the ache of it. She missed the noise of her family, the chaos, even the mess. But she didn't miss how invisible she used to feel inside it. She stayed her course. No guilt-laced rescues. No return to martyrdom. She had learned too much to go back. One Saturday morning, she was painting alone in her sunroom when her phone rang. It was her daughter. She stared at the name, her heart thudding. 100 possible conversations played out in her head before she picked up. "Hey, Mom." The voice was cautious, almost shy. "Hi, sweetie," Margaret replied, setting her brush down. A pause. "Then can we talk? In person?" An hour later her daughter arrived. No kids, no requests, no complaints, just a daughter, unsure of how to face the woman she thought she knew. They sat on the couch in silence for a few moments before her daughter finally spoke. "I didn't realize how much I leaned on you," she said quietly. "It's just you've always been there. And I guess I forgot you're a person, not a service." Margaret's eyes welled up, not with sadness, but with validation. She'd waited so long to hear those words. "I let it happen," Margaret admitted. "I wanted to feel needed. I thought that would bring me closer to all of you. But it didn't. It just made me disappear." Her daughter wiped a tear and nodded. "You didn't disappear, Mom. You just stopped shouting with your actions." And I finally heard the silence. That afternoon, for the first time in years, they had a real conversation, not about babysitting or schedules, but about life, about womanhood, about aging and guilt and freedom. And in that moment, Margaret felt something shift between them, not back to how it was, but towards something new, something better. A few days later, her son came by unexpectedly. This time, no laundry basket, no kids in tow, just him. "I owe you an apology," he said, standing awkwardly at her door. "I got used to you doing everything. I think I forgot to say thank you for, well, all of it." Margaret smiled, stepping aside. It's never too late to start. Even her grandson, curious and observant, had changed. On his next visit, he sat beside her while she painted. "Can I try?" he asked, watching her swirl a soft blue onto the canvas. "Of course," she said, handing him a brush. "You're really good, Grandma," he added. "I told my friends you're an artist now." She laughed gently, brushing a tear from her cheek. "I think I finally believe it." The respect that once eluded her didn't return all at once. It crept back in slowly, through changed tones, through apologies, through simple efforts. Her family began calling ahead instead of assuming. They asked instead of expected. Her daughter even offered to take her out for lunch, just the two of them. Margaret didn't have to yell to be heard. She just had to stop whispering. Her boundaries didn't push her family away. They pulled them closer. Because when she stopped sacrificing everything, she became more whole, and her family could finally see the woman behind the apron, behind the helping hands, the woman who had her own needs, her own passions, her own voice. And that voice was no longer quiet. Margaret sat alone on her porch, one quiet evening, a warm mug of tea in her hands, the sky painted in deep purples and gold. She could still hear her grandson's voice from earlier that day. "Grandma, I want to paint with you again next week," echoing in her heart. It was no longer a plea for her time out of expectation, but an invitation born of admiration. That was new. That was precious. She thought about how different her life had felt just a year ago, how trapped she had been in her own kindness, how no one had intended to take her for granted, but how easily they had, simply because she made it easy. She was always available, always agreeable, always saying yes, even when her body said no, even when her spirit begged for rest. She had built a prison of her own good intentions, and no one had noticed, because she never complained, not once. Now everything had changed, not because the world around her shifted, but because she had. She had drawn a line, not in anger, but in quiet certainty. She had stopped measuring her value by how useful she was, and started measuring it by how honest she could be about her own needs. And yes, it was hard. The backlash was real. Her children didn't clap when she changed. They winced, they argued, they called her selfish. But Margaret had learned something that too many seniors never do. Sometimes being called selfish is just the sound of others realizing they can't control you anymore. She had heard from other women at her art class, widows, grandmothers, a few divorced women, that they too had spent decades pouring out everything they had for everyone else, only to find themselves drained, disrespected, and quietly aching for someone to notice they were tired. So many seniors in this country are suffering not from illness, but from invisibility, from feeling like their only value lies in what they can still do for others, never in who they are. But Margaret was done being invisible. She realized that love without boundaries becomes servitude, that constantly giving without ever receiving doesn't make you generous, it makes you vanish, and worse, it teaches your family to see you as a function, not a person. Her daughter still struggled with the shift. Occasionally, the guilt trips returned, now more subtle. "I guess I'll just have to figure it out on my own then." But Margaret had learned how to hold the line. She would answer with grace but not surrender. "Yes, you probably will," she would say gently, and go back to her painting. Her son had grown quieter, more thoughtful. He called once a week, just to ask how she was. He never used to do that. Her grandchildren, too, had begun to see her not just as a free babysitter or a tired old woman in the background, but as someone worth listening to, someone with stories, someone with presence. And that shift, that evolution of how she was seen, all started the moment she chose to reclaim a word society had long taught her to fear. Selfish, but now to her selfishness meant clarity. It meant finally placing herself on her own list of priorities. It meant teaching others that she was not infinite, that her time was not disposable, and that her love didn't require her to disappear. To the seniors listening, to the women and men who've spent years putting everyone else first, Margaret would offer only this: your kindness is not the problem. Your heart is not the problem. The problem is when your kindness becomes expected, unnoticed, and unpaid in the currency of respect. It's okay to stop. It's okay to rest. It's okay to say no. It's okay to take up space in your own life again. Because sometimes, dignity doesn't come from giving more. It comes from finally giving to yourself. And if they call that selfish, then maybe it's time we redefine the word. If Margaret's story reminded you of your own, know this: it's never too late to change how your story ends. Have you ever felt like you've given so much, there's nothing left for yourself? Share your experience in the comments. Your story might give someone else the courage to set their first boundary. If this video moved you, don't keep it to yourself. Send it to a friend, a daughter, or even a grandchild. Sometimes, it only takes one honest story to help a family understand each other better. And if you'd like more stories that reflect the real struggles, strength, and wisdom of life after 60, be sure to subscribe. You deserve to be seen, heard, and respected, not just needed.